Okay. Well, thanks everybody for coming to this talk. I appreciate it. So first, I just wanted to give a little bit of context. I also want to say that I understand that there's a lot of, ex and current fisheries professionals, and so there may be some information in this talk that is, very much review to you, but I didn't really know who the audience would be, and so there's some, background information on, life history of winters and summers and that sort of thing that some people might need to just tune out of if they are already aware. So first, I just wanted to give a little bit of context about this talk. So this document called A Vision for Salmon and Steelhead, some of you may have seen this document. It came out in 2019. It was introduced to me in a class I took through Portland State University this prior year. And it's really an impressive document. I don't know, I wish, we were all in a room and I could ask how many people could raise their hand on how many people have seen it. But given the vast number of plans that we've all seen over the years, there's just been so many of them. I thought this document was something that did a great job really encompassing a lot of the broad views that are in the Columbia Basin on the whole, and I think a lot of those are reflected in the Hood River. And I mean, in the past, we've seen everything, from the master plan to Bonneville monitoring plans to, Hawley's plan to the revised master plan, the Watershed action plan, Power Conservation Council plans, ODFW's conservation recovery plans, NOAA's recovery plans, the revised master plan for the Hood River that was submitted last year. It's just there's so many of them, and I think this document does a good job really hitting what was missing, which is a coordinated basin-wide multi-partner long-term vision with a common set of goals. So if you haven't seen it, it's online. You can get it off NOAA's website there, and I would encourage people to look at it. What it does tell me is all of these plans that are out there and floating around is that this issue is really complex in terms of recovering salmon and steelhead populations throughout the Columbia Basin. Me personally, through this program, since Bonneville, pays my salary, then I always deferred to the revised master plan in terms of, how do I evaluate salmon and steelhead populations in the Hood River, and what's the bar? What do you, when you're reporting numbers, what do they mean? And so I always gave context in annual reports and presentations based on this revised master plan and these goals that were stated within. And this obviously preceded my time here with ODFW, and I'm very unfamiliar as to how a lot of these were derived, but nevertheless, that's what I always defer to in terms of my measuring stick. But really, what this plan is really about is to find a lot of those overlapping goals and missions that are amongst everybody, amongst all the stakeholders, and put those together. And so I started thinking about that just in terms of like, what could that mean for, our Hood River populations, and how could we think about things a little bit differently, potentially, if we subscribe to this type of mentality. The overall goal for this vision for salmon and steelhead is stated to aspire to healthy and harvestable levels of salmon and steelhead. But the goals also reflect current landscape. So typically a lot of the goals that are stated in local regional recovery plans are often based on ESA delisting. And this plan takes it kind of one step further and really puts it on a healthy and harvestable level, but tapers that down to reflect sort of what's changed, in our landscape over the past couple hundred years. So we're not obviously shooting for, pre-settlement type numbers, but somewhere in between. And that's kind of what this graph depicts. Is sort of, you can see that healthy and harvestable level there, somewhere in between ESA recovery and historical potential. So, the way that it's written in the plan is first, the idea being that you meet ESA recovery, and then NMFS will work with the stakeholders to take it to the next level, which is provide sustainable fisheries. This document was derived from something called the situation assessment, which was also something that we were required to review and read for that Portland State University class that I took. And it was really interesting. They interviewed over 200 people from, with different stakeholders, different perspectives all across the Columbia that had some knowledge of salmon or some stake in the Columbia in terms of, navigation, irrigation, fishing, whatever the case may be. And a lot of things came out of that. Two of the main ones were, one, people were really frustrated with the lack of leadership in terms of trying to recover salmon, because the efforts have been ongoing for some decades now, and with not a lot of tangible results up to this point. And a lot of people were also really frustrated with what they called institutional gridlock, which I know a lot of the folks that are on this call have experienced within their own agencies and between agencies, I'm sure. And what this plan ended up doing was setting quantitative provisional goals that were eventually adopted in 2019. And provisional goals meaning that they could change over time. And really the idea being that this task force saw the work that folks were doing on the regional and local levels, and really what they wanted to do is keep that momentum going, because what you're starting to see is in certain situations, lack of funding, lack of organizational direction, those kinds of things are starting to sort of erode some of the progress that was made over the last 20, 25 years. And then the next step in terms of context is really talking about viable salmonid populations. So when a group like us, the Hood River Research Program, when I have to report, I use that revised master plan as sort of the measuring board. Okay, so if there's goals in the master plan, how are we doing relative to those goals? But also, it's imperative to really build in what NOAA Fisheries dictates, for recovery. And so that's kind of what's going to guide what I'm going to report to you in this presentation. Viable, in terms of what they call viable salmonid populations, is one that has a negligible extinction risk over the next 100 years. And it's evaluated using these 4 parameters, and I'll go into more detail on each of these as we get to them. But first, wanted to give just a little bit of background if folks aren't really familiar with Hood River salmon and steelhead. The first thing I'm going to say is that this talk is based solely on steelhead, even though there are populations of fallen spring chinook and coho and bull trout and cutthroat trout and other salmonids in the basin. This talk is centered solely on steelhead. And what this map depicts is what you'll see is that the Hood is one of a handful of basins in Oregon that has naturally occurring summer and winter steelhead in the basin. And in Hood River, generally speaking, summer steelhead are restricted to mostly the West Fork Basin, and winter steelhead are found mostly in the East Fork and Middle Fork. Both of these run types are listed as threatened under the ESA. This is sort of a kind of a broad overview based on telemetry records that ODFW collected in the 90s and early 2000s as to where winter run steelhead may be found. These were adult spawning steelhead that were tagged at Powerdale Dam on their way up. And as you can see, they are generally confined to East and Middle, but also Greenpoint Creek in the West Fork. Summer run, based on the same telemetry data set, you also see that, generally speaking, they are in the West Fork with some overlap. And so these lines are obviously not delineated 100%, but pretty close. Same with run timing. You'll see that generally the winter and summer run types, as they come into the Hood River, are fairly temporally distinct, but there are overlap periods. Life history of winters, typically when they enter the river, they're usually sexually mature. As the map shows, the shorter migration that they have from the ocean, the more likely they are to be winter run in Oregon. And they generally enter freshwater anywhere from November to May and spawn in the spring months, March through May. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of what it looks like from data that we've collected over the years in terms of actual pit tag detection. So if those of you that aren't familiar with pit tags, these are small, what they call passive integrated transponders that are inserted into a fish at the juvenile life stage. And that picture depicts a rotary screw trap where fish are captured at the juvenile life stage. And then we can sample them and insert pit tags into them and then monitor movements as they move in and out of the basin. The blue dots on the map are places where we have rotary screw trap fishing locations in the Hood River and have had for about 25 years. So an example of that is, so we had a fish that was a winter run fish that was tagged at our main stem screw trap, which is about where Powerdale Dam used to be, and was tagged in May of 2013. And then that fish was detected as a returning adult after it spent 2 years in the ocean in March of 2015 at Bonneville Dam. And, 2.5 weeks later at the mouth of the Hood River, it was detected there. And then it was caught at an adult sampling facility roughly a month after that, and then was caught a few days later at another adult sampling facility, that one being up at the East Fork Irrigation facility, the intake there. And then that fish was detected leaving Bonneville Dam and going back downstream, presumably to make another ocean migration, as steelhead are known to do, in early May. And that's a pretty typical example of what migration behavior for a spawning adult winter steelhead looks like. Summers are a little bit different. Generally, they're migrating longer distances to reach their streams. They are typically sexually immature when they enter fresh water, which can be any time from May to November. They can continue to feed for potentially up to a year prior to spawning, and they do usually have high lipid stores to make their long migrations that are usually arduous journeys. And then they typically spawn in the spring months after overwintering in their basin or somewhere nearby. A pit tag example of a summer fish could look like this, where one was tagged as a juvenile at our screw trap in May on its way out, and then was returning to Bonneville Dam as an adult 2 years later in September, and then was caught at an adult sampling facility in the West Fork of the Hood River in late October of that year, and then was detected moving out downstream, going downstream at Bonneville in May of 2016. So it appears that the fish spent the winter in Hood River, presumably spawned and then left in May. Another example of a pit tag summer, because they are really interesting, was tagged in 2013 in May, was detected 5 days later by the NOAA estuary trawl, where these boats trawl huge, or they run big trawl nets behind that have a pit tag antenna at the end of the net instead of a closed cod end, and it detects fish as they're moving out of the river. And then that fish was detected 2 years later in July at Bonneville Dam, moving upstream as an adult, overshot to the Dalles Dam in October, and then was captured at the Moving Falls facility in the West Fork of the Hood River in November, and then was also captured again the following April, and this is what that fish looked like at that time, so pretty good shape. And so those are just some examples of what the migrations look like for winters and summers in the Hood. So the first VSP parameter, or viable salmonid population parameter that we'll look at, is abundance. First, we'll look at juvenile abundance. So juvenile abundance is something that we estimate using mark recapture methods, and the analysis is done using a program called DAR, and it's an interesting program and really ideal for what we do in the Hood River, because we don't have a big population, and DAR does a good job of aggregating the data for our small population. It does account for temporal variability, because what you can do when you input your mark recapture data is you can stratify it based on time periods. So for example, I do that for 10-day periods, and it also groups strata based on the likelihood of trapping efficiency, it's really good for the hood because early in our season, we usually start running our screw traps in late March or early April when the water's still fairly cold and fish aren't typically moving much yet. And we fish them all the way till the end of June. And so fish that sometimes we catch up in the upper reaches of, the forks, we can tag them, say, in early April, but they may not move for another month or 6 weeks or 8 weeks. And so what this program can do is it accounts and aggregates for fish that spend that much time before they get recaptured at the screw trap that's down at the lower part of the river, versus fish that might make their migration in a day or two. And so it's really effective for that. And what we've seen over the years is an average abundance of about 17,000, a little over 17,000. But what we have seen is, a fairly substantial increase from pre-Powerdale days to post-Powerdale Dam days. And that was, for folks that don't know, Powerdale Dam was taken out in 2010 and was located at about river mile 4.5 on the Hood River. And that seemed and appeared to, that increased habitat connectivity seemed to have a really positive effect on juvenile salmonids in the Hood River. For adults, how those are monitored is those pit tags. When we tag them as juveniles, when they come back as adults, they'll get detected at Bonneville Dam in the fish ladders there, and we can treat those fish as a mark fish. And then as they're recaught in the Hood River or not at adult sampling locations, then we can use that information to estimate how many of them total that there were. What it does is it estimates this entire population between Bonneville Dam and the capture sites in the Hood River. And really what we're interested in is only the Hood River. What's unknown is what survives between Bonneville Dam and the Hood. And so we address that using a survival model that gives us Hood River specific run estimates. The adult collection facilities, in case you're not aware of them, not all of these are in play right now, but the first two that came online were the East Fork Weir and the Neal Creek Weir. And the Neal Creek Weir was decommissioned in, I think, about 2015 or 16. The East Fork Weir still runs sometimes. Moving Falls, which was came online in 2013 in the West Fork of the Hood River, and then the East Fork irrigation intake has a fish ladder that the district biologists run a trap in that ladder. So we have opportunities to recapture fish there, and that came online in 2014. So using all that information, we can estimate a closed population, like I said, in that gray area, and then we use a Cormack-Jolly-Stieber open population model to estimate how many fish get, essentially how many fish are lost in that section between Bonneville and the Hood River mouth. And we can do that because we have a pit tag antenna installed at the mouth of the Hood River that's allowed to detect adult fish as they're moving upstream, that the Confederated tribes monitors and manages that site. And essentially that gives us a closed population estimate for the Hood River. So I know that was a really short and brief and quick and messy way to explain that, but it'll have to do. And what we've seen over the years is that for winter run fish, there have been, population swings. Summer run fish have been fairly restricted over the years. There is a gap in between 2010 and 2014 where we were unable to estimate populations of summer fish. We just didn't have the data capabilities to do that because we didn't have a location to catch them as adults. Once Moving Falls Fish Facility came online, then we were able to do that in subsequent years. And what we've seen over the years is an average population for winters of, as you see, is 566, with the master plan goal was set at almost twice that. And then the summer run has been fairly stagnant, averaging about 254 with a master plan goal of 600. Productivity is the next thing that we can use to look at viable salmonid populations. And essentially what we do is a recruit per spawner analysis on that. And what this tells you is on the x-axis there, you can see the total winter steelhead spawners, which does include wild and hatchery fish, and then the number of recruits that were generated from those spawning adults in subsequent years per adult. So a value of 1 indicates that that population is replacing itself, 1 fish and then, you know, generating 1 fish per fish. For both winter and summer steelhead, as you can see on the graph, the more spawners that you have, what they call productivity or recruits per spawner diminishes, and that's pretty typical of populations that are considered density dependent, where at a certain point it doesn't really matter how many more spawners you throw in, you're not going to get more recruits because of that. The average recruit per spawner value for winters is 0.93, which is fairly stable, and summers is slightly less than that at 0.8. It should be accounted for, though, that you know, it does include all spawning adult fish, which does include wild and hatchery fish, and some of the summer spawner numbers include fish that were not native broodstock Hood River fish. They were an out-of-basin stock, a Skamania stock, that were considered available to spawn, but were likely not very successful spawners. So that does influence that number a little bit. And then the next step, what you can do is you can sort of determine, you know, by fitting your recruit per spawner data to a model. There's a few different types of models for recruit spawner information. One of those being what's called Beverton-Holt model, which is a density dependent model. And that model assumes that, like I just said, at a certain time or a certain threshold of spawners that you will not get more recruits over time. And running that model indicates that our peak recruitment is about 500 adults. That's what that little RP number on the bottom is, that's highlighted in the table, which does indicate that you know, the hood may have density dependence issues. Another way you can look at productivity is the number of smolts you can generate per spawner. So on the x-axis, you'll see the total number of spawners, summer and winter combined this time, because smolts we cannot tell if they're winter or summer, so we have to pool them all together. And what you see is that in most years, it's 25,000 or less, regardless of how many spawners are available. And so that could indicate that maybe that the basin is somewhere near, you know, its carrying capacity. I've got carrying capacity listed there, and you can see it's just over 30,000 fish combined, winter and summer combined, and that was based on models that back in like Hawley's day, I think Steve Kramer had done some what they called ecosystem diagnostic modeling or something like that. There was a unit characteristic method model also that were used to generate these based on habitat variables, what the carrying capacity of the basin was. And at that time, that's what they deemed it to be. And in reality, it might not be that far off. Given this, when you look at this chart, and you can kind of see there's not many data points that fall above 25,000, regardless of the abundance of spawners. And then, of course, you look at the scatter, and that, to me, indicates how environmentally messy the Hood River can be when it comes to, you know, environmental variability. As we all know that are from here, that live here, you see the river come up and down dramatically, and the effects of a glacial fed system. So that's most likely what that represents. In terms of spatial distribution is the next thing, and I'll explain this a little bit more because it's not as clear cut as abundance and productivity, but really what they're talking about here is it could be within a population segment itself, like the whole lower Columbia River steelhead population, or to a local population like the Hood River population. And really what it's about is, you know, how much available habitat's there, and what is the connectivity of the habitat, and what's the occupancy of the habitat. So in a lot of systems like the John Day, for instance, I know that they gauge their spatial distribution based on metrics like red occupancy. So they actually get to go out and do red surveys where they'll walk the stream and they'll look in areas where they know that salmon have been, or steelhead have been known to spawn, and then they can determine based on what percentages of those known spawning sites are occupied or not. They can get an idea about what spatial distribution looks like. And in the Hood River, we don't have that kind of data. We don't do red surveys. It's just not really feasible here in this basin. And so that's something that, a question for viable salmonid population reporting that we struggle to answer a little bit. But spatial distribution obviously does influence the viability of the population if that distribution is really confined and if they're not spread out, and if there's not habitat potential to be tapped into there. What I can say is that generally speaking, as I showed in this graph earlier with distribution, that that our spatial distribution does typically follow the ecotype. So we know where our summers are located and we know where our winters are located based off old telemetry. And also what I can say is that over time that doesn't have seemed to have changed much. So these relocations were based on telemetry data in the 90s and then 1 year in 2001. And we did a little bit of telemetry in 2013 and 2014, and then did a probability model based off of habitat metrics like habitat type, gravel percentage, slope of the stream, width of the stream, and found that, for example, this is a map of probability spawning for winter steelhead. And if you look at that, and the warm colors being the hot zones for spawning, or the higher likelihood zones for spawning, and you go back to this picture of what the 90s telemetry said, not much has changed over time, or appears to have, in terms of distribution. So at least what we can say is that stability of spatial distribution seems to be pretty high. It seems to be stable for now, and which means something, especially given that a major obstruction in Powerdale Dam was removed in 2010. What we're lacking when it comes to the spatial distribution is juvenile data. We don't have much. We know a lot about movement. We know when they're moving in terms of making their migrations based on our screw trapping. But what we don't know is like what their distribution looks like over the calendar year. We don't really know about what the par numbers look like. So we know about smolts, and we can gauge those and assess those pretty well, but we do not have a real stronghold on par abundance at all. And that would be a really interesting project. If anybody knows any like graduate students or smart people that want to do a cool project, I think it'd be really interesting to do a small scale, radio telemetry project to look at what the seasonal movements are of these fish, especially given, the irrigation presence in the Hood River, the environmental variability that the Hood River sees. I think it would be really fascinating to learn more about that. We could learn probably a lot about, where potential stable kind of nursery type areas are. And then the last thing is diversity. And diversity is similar to spatial structure in the sense that really what you're looking for is you want diversity in order to withstand potential perturbations or change. I mean, that's really what it's about. It's you want to maintain, it's not just genetic diversity, but the ability for fish to respond if there's environmental change or other perturbations or anthropogenic influences. And a lot of ways in how diversity is assessed, or how I've seen it assessed by other folks. One is run timing. So, for example, this is based on that same 90s 2001 telemetry data set, and this is just a cumulative river mile on the y-axis. So all of the fish combined, what river mile were they relocated at over what time period? And it shows a real nice curve of what the typical spawning migration looks like for winter steelhead. And then similar to spatial distribution, we can compare that information to what we are learning now. So these are migration patterns for the years 2018 and 2019. And you can see on the y-axis, on the primary y-axis there on the left, it's kind of the proportion of the total run, and then by date on the x-axis, and then I have flow on the secondary y-axis on the side, just so you can see how fish tend to respond to a flow event, tends to get them moving. And what you can see is that the patterns are very similar to this chart, where you see April and May migrations, and you see it here as they're moving upstream, because this is based on captures at the East Fork Weir, which is at about river mile 14, I think. And so these are fish that are presumably heading up to spawn, and that's what these captures represent. And summer, it's we don't have as many fish to sample, but you can see you know, that the presumed migration times are fairly well represented by contemporary 2018, 2019 run populations. Oh, the other thing worth mentioning here is that the red and blue lines are for wild and hatchery fish, and that they tend to mirror each other pretty well. And that's, you know, my guess is that's because brood selection in this basin is done very carefully. In a lot of basins, I think what you see when hatchery broodstock are collected is that a lot of the first fish are taken to meet goals, or that's what had happened over the years. And so a lot of hatchery runs come in much earlier than the wild run does, and you don't see that so much in the Hood River. I think they've been pretty judicious about broodstock collection over the years, and it's represented. And then genetic diversity. I'm obviously not going to go over this whole chart because it's really boring, but what it does indicate is that it does show what they call the PNOB, so proportion of natural origin broodstock. So how many natural origin or wild fish were in the broodstock that produced the hatchery fish? And then the PHOS number, which is the proportion of hatchery origin spawners, and then a calculation that you can derive from that called proportion natural influence, which there's a standard at about 0.67 where it's deemed acceptable hatchery practices to have a proportion natural influence of 0.67 or more. And you can see that in most years the Hood's done a good job of meeting that standard. So probably withstanding some genetic diversity here, even though we do have a hatchery program. So in summary, just in terms of the VSP parameters, when you talk about abundance, does the Hood River have a sustainable number of spawners? NOAA Fisheries in their guide for VSP monitoring sort of threw out the number of 500 adults being sort of the kind of minimum number. Obviously that depends on sort of the size of the watershed and the composition of the fish population, but do we have a sustainable number of spawners? Probably for winter fish, probably not for summer fish would be my assessment. Productivity, is the population capable of responding when perturbations exist? I think if you go back and look at some of those recruit per spawner curves, I think you would say that yes, Hood River's very volatile, and I think productivity is probably very reasonable for Hood River steelhead populations. Again, probably more so for winters than summers though. Spatial structure, is available habitat increasing or stable at least, and are key habitats preserved? That's really where groups like the Watershed group can make a difference and have something to say about that. I'm not sure I can answer that question, to be honest with you. Same with diversity. Are variations in life history, morphology, and genetics maintained? I mean, they appear to be, but with hatchery programs where you're ultimately, even though you're taking natural origin broodstock, you're likely over time diminishing genetic variation. Does that have an impact, and if so, what kind? I guess that's another question I probably can't answer. Given that, does anybody have any questions? That's the end of my presentation.
Well, I learned something new or relearn it each time you give a talk. I really enjoyed that. That was excellent. I can ask the first question. When you said, so when you were talking about density dependence, that you were getting at the sort of the capacity, the habitat capacity, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a big part of it. When, if you're seeing effects like that where, you have, X number of fish coming in and it doesn't matter how big that X is, and you're not seeing more recruits out of that, then that would indicate that potentially you could be up against, carrying capacity, which is an interesting question, because if you look at the goals that were presented, the goal for winter steelhead spawners is 1,100, and yet recruit per spawner data would indicate that maximum recruitment is about half of that at 500. So it begs the question, is the 1,100 fish goal reasonable, or does that need to be reconfigured?
On that topic, Phil, do you think that having significantly more wood in the river, and of course I think the low flows in the Hood River have gone up with all the conservation we've had. Of course, we don't know what the future holds with the glaciers and climate. But wouldn't that have an effect on carrying capacity and density dependence if there were more favorable, greater habitat capacity, greater habitat diversity, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the master plan specifically stated that. I think there was with summer steelhead in particular, there was an initiative in that revised master plan to move the carrying capacity from like 13,800 something to 20,000 by the year 2019, and that was, through those types of measures: water conservation, habitat improvements, those kinds of things. And so, yeah, absolutely, I think that's something that the Watershed group, especially with the the strategic action planning that's going on, with the OWEB FIP planning, application process, that's something that certainly could be pointed to as a benefit.
This is Alex. I had a quick question on abundance. Do you have any guess on that, the abundance numbers that you threw out as a % of historic?
So yeah, so the historic numbers, and this is based off of the NOAA recovery plan, and it was reported that there was like 3,800 winter and 3,800 summer steelhead historically in the Hood. And I'm not sure exactly where they derived those numbers, but I'm just saying that's what they reported. So I know on the Columbia as a whole, if you ask folks now, they'd say the Columbia Basin, historically produced anywhere from 5 to 16 million salmonids annually, which is a wide range in my opinion. But and now you're talking less than 3 per year, of which like 40% are wild, 60% are hatchery. So I don't know. Maybe the Hood River one might be a little high, but it's probably reasonable if you believe the Columbia River historical numbers too.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from Rob Greenman, and Rob, feel free to, you had asked in the chat box about comments on stay-at-home counterparts, and I'm assuming you're meaning the rainbow trout, the resident rainbow trout, and how strategic action planning groups are helping these native populations. And I would say, Rob, that the actions that the group has, the partnership really has been working on for the past 20 plus years, and moving into the future, this action plan that we're about to release will also benefit resident rainbow trout as much as the anadromous species in the basin.
Cool, thanks, Cindy.
Hey, Phil, given everything that you presented and all of the, years of information and so on, and also realizing that the Hood, as you pointed out, is a really volatile system, I'm curious, what do you see as the primary threat to steelhead in the Hood River Basin?
Well, me personally, I mean, coming from restoration work prior to coming here, if it were me, I would work on things I could control, which I think the Watershed group does a good job of doing, which are water availability and fish passage type projects. I think those are strong, and they certainly have their fingers in other things too. I mean, there are in-stream projects happening as well. I personally would find, I mean, just coming from the coastal streams where the gradient is, a nice calm 1 to 3%, as opposed to coming to the Hood River where it's much higher, I would be afraid to go splashing logs in streams in a lot of places. But if you look at, historical reference points, I'm sure there was a lot more of that back in the day than there is now. So there's certainly a need for those types of projects. But, for me, I would focus on, water availability, and allowing fish as much access and habitat connectivity as humanly possible.
Phil, I had a quick question about, it seems like the hatchery steelhead aren't, even with more spawners, it's not necessarily increasing the population. Is there a lot of pressure to increase the hatchery programs for these fish, or what's kind of the status or the thinking right now around the hatchery program for the steelhead?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a very complex one. I think it depends a lot on the basin. If you look at the Columbia as a whole, a lot of the hatchery production was certainly for mitigation purposes, and that continues to be a driver for a lot of groups, especially tribal groups, that were promised when the dams were built that there would be fish to catch, and that hatchery fish production would provide that opportunity for them. And so I think that's still, that focus is still there, and that need is still there. But how hatchery fish interact and impact native fish varies a ton, basin by basin. I think the differences between how that might happen in the Hood River versus the Klickitat or up somewhere upriver, I think it can vary a lot based on hatchery practices and what's happening with the wild population at the time. So that'll be something that's going to be ongoing for a long time. I will say that vision for salmon and steelhead certainly recognized the hatchery fish component, and they included it as part of the equation. So I think you can expect it moving forward. Hatchery science has come a long way in the last 25 years, in my opinion. So.
John asked if Warm Springs was going to had any plans to stop the winter steelhead hatchery program. Megan, do you want to? Are you in a position to answer that question? Or Phil or Jason? I know it's a co-managed hatchery program.
My question is, what's the reasoning you want the fisheries program to stop?
Well, I think he had heard that or something. Anyway, if you're seeing the chat box.
Yeah, I can answer it, Cindy.
Okay.
So the current plan is there was brood stock taken this spring for winter steelhead. Those fish are currently being reared in the hatchery, and they'll be sent to Oak Springs. And there will be no more brood taken for winter steelhead. So the program is being canceled, and that was a decision that was made by Bonneville Power and Upper Fish Division within ODFW. And so we will have a couple more years of hatchery returns, and we'll continue to operate the weir to remove hatchery fish until no more hatchery fish are returning.
Okay, thanks for that. Boy, that was, I didn't know that. And Megan had responded that last year for smolt release is 2021.
For
Okay,
winter
right,
still.
which is for winter, right? Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that.
So Phil, I wanted to ask a question kind of related to that. So was your data saying with what was projected to be the carrying capacity of the Hood, just related to this wild hatchery thing, was it saying that it's limited? I mean, it sort of hit this plateau, and it doesn't matter whether there's more hatchery fish or more wild fish, it's still just at this plateau. Is that correct?
I mean, you know, you have to obviously think about the year-to-year environmental variation that occurs within the Hood River, but I would say generally speaking, that seems to be the case. There seems to be sort of a stopping point for them at this point, you know, at least, you know, for juvenile production. So short of, like what Holly said, short of more, you know, habitat improvement or habitat availability, you know, then this could be about what the basin's, you know, capable of producing.
Okay, thanks. That's
Yeah.
what I was thinking that meant.
So I've got a question out to, you know, the various fisheries biologists that are on the call and have experience with the Hood, that in finalizing the action plan and the background data we have over the past several years, really the past 7 years or so, there have been 7-8 years, have been some really good studies done, including IFIM studies that were mostly geared towards looking at stream flows, the stream flow relationship to, you know, habitat availability or habitat suitability for the different species in the basin. And one of the conclusions that Normandow, one of the groups that did IFIM studies, was that there was a real lack of holding habitat kind of across all of the sites that they did these IFIM study reaches. And those were not, they didn't do these, the IFIM reaches in the upper portions of the basin. They're in the, you know, sort of midsection of the East Fork and West Fork, Neal Creek. And I am wondering if, as we start to, my sense with our action planning and where we're going, there's going to continue to be work in the upper portions of the basin with various partners, but that we're going to be starting to move into the, hopefully some parts of the main stem, but, you know, lower down in the East Fork, possibly the Middle Fork, but a lot of attention in the East Fork. And from what we can tell, there is potential, even though it is volatile. So I'm wondering, if the steelhead biologists on the call, how much of an impact do you think that might have on carrying capacity?
So you were cutting in and out there, Cindy. Are you talking about increasing holding areas for winter steelhead?
Well, the IFIM, Normandow's IFIM study pointed out that across all of their study sites, they noted a lack of holding habitat. Didn't really matter how much flow you added. This is, you know, in the summertime, it still didn't increase holding habitat. So the structure's not there. You know, kind of a lot of fast riffles. And as we add structure, I think that's one of the things that the Watershed Group and partners haven't really done before, is worked more farther downstream on the private lands, and we're going in that direction. So as we go in that direction, do you suspect that we might see an increase potentially in carrying capacity for steelhead, let's say.
Yeah, if there was certainly if the gradient was structured to where it was more of a pool riffle rather than what is mostly is now, which is pretty much a gradient riffle, certainly juvenile steelhead would benefit from that. I mean, the adult steelhead, you know, aren't necessarily, I mean, they need a little bit of resting when they come back, but especially winters, you know, by the time they get to the East Fork, they're not holding for very long prior to spawning.
So I personally feel like the Hood River Basin in and of itself is very constrained naturally and a very high gradient. So if you're able to be creative and original enough to work around those stipulations and actually get some overwinter habitat that stays overwinter instead of getting flushed out, I think it would be highly beneficial for increasing smolt and par populations.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest restriction in the East Fork is probably the highway corridor.
There's quite a bit of downstream of there. There's quite a bit of floodplain opportunities for some more connectivity with historic floodplains, and definitely opportunity for increasing complexity, assuming that private landowners are on board with that. But, and there's actually, you know, some ODOT land, and there, you know, when you look at Google Earth and the land ownership data, I was surprised to see some places downstream of Forest Service land that were in public ownership, and there was actually some good looking potential.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the more, I mean, Megan's right, you know, the more habitat diversity you can create, you know, whether it's, you know, off channel, you know, diversity of channels, you know, something that's not just a long riffle, you know, that's what's going to benefit steelhead.
So are there any other questions out there? If I hear none, how about we all give Phil a nice round of applause? I think we can do that. You unmute and we'll all hear it. So thanks a lot, Phil. Very good job.
Thanks, Bill. Good job. That was awesome.
Yeah, really good.
Thank you.